Good morning, everyone. Can I say what an honour it is to be invited to speak here this morning. This is a historic occasion, and it is wonderful to be a guest of the Sami people. Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute. It's also a great pleasure for me to experience for the first time the wonderful countryside and the culture of the Sami people. So it has been a rich and enjoyable experience so far, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversations today as well. My starting point here...
If you are speaking here, you don't need this one, you can use this one.
Yes, okay. Okay. Maybe that wasn't translated, I don't know, but I was simply saying it is an honour to be a guest of the Sami people here on this historic occasion. What do we mean when we talk about the word reconciliation? My theme this morning is to offer some theoretical perspectives on this question, and in particular to highlight the fact that different people mean different things by the language they use. This can lead to confusion, and it can also lead to a conflict of expectations that can undermine the best plans. So people, for instance, will use the same words in different ways and mean different things, and I will illustrate that. So just to start with a widely known and accepted account of reconciliation by the great theorist and practitioner John Paul Lederach. He says that reconciliation is a place of encounter. It is where ideas, people, and stories meet and interact with each other. It is not a third-party process conducted by lawyers or governments or even NGOs or individuals on behalf of other people. It is where things encounter, collide, and create a new reality. He says that it really involves three things, and I think this is common to all the ideas I'm going to give you this morning. First of all, it is space for acknowledgement of the past, not a dwelling in the past, not an obsession with the past, not even necessarily a forensic examination of the past. It is impossible to tell the whole truth about the past, but it is to acknowledge that past and the effect and the cost it has for individuals. Secondly, and this is perhaps the least well-developed part of reconciliation theory and practice, it is about envisioning of a new future, creating a shared picture of a future which is based on new norms and the idea of interdependence rather than conflict, the envisioning of the future. And what John Paul Lederach says is that by holding these two different things together, it is possible to change the present and therefore to create ways of moving forward. So reconciliation is about simultaneously looking at the past, the present, and the future. And I said, and John Paul Lederach has said, is a place of encounter. And he says some very interesting things about the nature of this encounter. First of all, it is a place, reconciliation is a place where people encounter themselves, their own story, their own needs, their own relationships, and their own histories. So it is a place where people are encouraged and need to reflect on themselves. Secondly, it is where they encounter their enemies, or those who have caused them harm, or at least those who think differently or with whom they may disagree. But he says another very interesting thing, which is that this encounter is not just about the stories of the past, nor visions of the future. It is actually an encounter where people need to expose and share their hopes and their fears, not just their stories, their hopes and their fears. So, John Paul Lederach speaks for many, I think, when he gives that broad, unchallenging account of what reconciliation is. However, the history of the many reconciliation projects around the world, of which Eduardo has described some, suggests that this can take many different forms. And the political theorist Ernesto Vedea has helpfully classified reconciliation programs into 3 different types. The first of all is what he calls minimalist. These are attempts at reconciliation which are primarily concerned with enabling a society and individuals to move on. That is the important thing, to move on from the conflict. The second is what Ernesto Vedea calls deliberative. And this is a more ambitious program. This aims to reform the society post-conflict. And the third is what he calls maximalist. And this is where the goal of reconciliation is to try and bring about the transformation of society and the transformation of individuals. In particular, individuals and groups who have been wounded in some way by the past will somehow be healed. The problem we have to face in looking at these different definitions is that people use the same words but for different purposes and with different meanings. And I'm going to illustrate that in a second. So just to give you a tiny picture of this spectrum of approaches here, the situation in Northern Ireland is really not much more than a minimalist attempt at reconciliation so far. There has been no real attempt to look systematically at the past. There has been no real attempt to look at healing. But there is a sustained political desire to find ways of moving on. Contrast that with South Africa, where a lot of attention has been paid with success and with failure to enable individuals to be healed. The slogan of the public hearings of the Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was "Revealing is healing." It's a very controversial statement. So you'll see that immediately looking at 2 examples, they are in different places on Vedea's spectrum. And this means we should expect different results. So let me just go into this in a little more detail. So when Vedea talks about a minimalist approach to reconciliation, moving on, this means at its least the cessation of violence, the end of violence. It means a commitment to the rule of law, a shared commitment to the rule of law, and it means a robust form of politics where differences are resolved through political debate and discernment. And that's as much as it says. The difficulties with this are that this doesn't give a lot of space for the victims of conflict to express their needs. It certainly provides no space for them to be healed. And in fact, it can coerce them into silence. One of the big criticisms of the situation in Northern Ireland is the fact that 3,000 unsolved murders remain unexplored. And so therefore the victims and their families and the survivors have no real place in Northern Ireland at the moment. And that the past can remain unexplored has many other consequences, not least the failure to achieve justice and accountability of perpetrators. So the minimalist approach, whilst it may enable society to move on, and is relatively simple, it is primarily a question of political will to achieve, comes at some cost. The deliberative approach has, in addition to the cessation of violence, the rule of law, etc., puts great emphasis on human rights, on institutional reform, on justice and accountability, holding the perpetrators of violence accountable for what they've done. And in particular, it creates a new narrative, a new story that a society can tell about itself. It has limitations as well. It requires powerful and enlightened leadership. And there is a very interesting question about the extent to which this form of reconciliation relies on remarkable individuals. It is quite resource intensive. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission can be very expensive. In South Africa, over 10 years ago, it cost in the region of $20 million. Other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been considerably more expensive. And this form of deliberative approach to reconciliation requires everyone's consent. It requires the consent of victims, but it also requires the consent of previous regimes, political actors, perpetrators of violence, that what they have done will be exposed. The maximalist approach, the transformative approach, goes further. It's focused on re-establishing relationships between people who have been divided or separated by violence. And there is a controversial phrase which is often used here, which is to talk about right relationships, relationships which are somehow better than those that preceded them. It explicitly talks about the healing of wounds, and it often invokes the questions of repentance and forgiveness, which are morally complex and politically very difficult to achieve. And the problems with the maximalist approach is that it can paradoxically be unjust. This is particularly the case where perpetrators of violence may be given amnesty or shown mercy in order for them to be reintegrated into the community. So it may well be that a victim's thirst for justice is denied by a society which puts great priority on the reintegration of offenders. It can cause harm to the victims. Testifying in public can be a traumatizing and dangerous experience. And certainly, if victims are left unsupported, the process of telling the truth may actually do them more psychological harm than good. And this is a very skill-intensive process. The way that public hearings, the way that testimonies are taken, the ways that individuals are prepared to tell their stories require a lot of skilled work and should not be undertaken unless those skills are present. So whilst it may seem at first glance that the minimalist approach is not very desirable, there are difficulties with deliberative and maximalist approaches, which means it may be the least worst option. So one of the underlying points to all these approaches is what Verdere calls the establishment of new norms, new agreements, social agreements about what is important in the way citizens and the state behave. And he says there are 5. That there is a commitment to share the truth about the past, however imperfect that may be achieved. Secondly, there is a commitment to hold perpetrators accountable. Thirdly, there is a commitment to acknowledge victims, acknowledge them as people, and acknowledge what has happened to them. Fourthly, there is a commitment to the rule of law. And fifthly, there is a commitment to try and achieve mutual respect between previous enemies. And it is very important that there's a big distinction, for instance, between the minimalist model, which says enemies do not need to become friends to achieve reconciliation. All that is required is some form of mutual respect and a cessation of violence. A maximalist model would seek to try and change the relationship between enemies from one of animosity and hatred into one of cooperation. So let me just look briefly in a little more detail about these three models. First of all, the minimalist one. So Andrew Schaap is a political philosopher who is one of the primary proponents of the minimalist model. If he might not describe himself like that, but that's how I see him. And he talks about the minimalist model starting from a situation where you have citizens divided by the memories of past wrongs. And the minimalist model tries to create a new political space. Remember what Lederach says about a space for, or a place for encounter. For Schaap, what has been created is a political space, a new political space, which has a constitution, a robust constitution that enables political argument to take place creatively and safely. Secondly, he uses this difficult word, forgiveness. What he means here is that the political space has to enable the grip that the past holds on the present to be loosened or relinquished. He describes that process as forgiveness, but other people use that word in a completely different way, so be careful. He also uses another word which is often interpreted differently, which is remembrance, that there has to be some accountability for the past in this political space. And then finally, that he says that this political space needs to be orientated towards the future. There is responsibility for moving society forward at all costs. So that is the minimalist model. Let me just illustrate this further. Reconciliation in the minimalist model is seen as a political process rather than a goal. There is no state at which a society is described as reconciled. Reconciliation is an open-ended process of political movement. To illustrate this, if we just look at the situation in Australia, where the indigenous people and the settlers, the Europeans and others who arrived from the 16th century onwards, where there has been not only a truth and reconciliation operation of some size, looking at the stolen generations, the children who were taken away to schools and forcibly re-educated, as has happened here. But also there was a famous national apology given to the indigenous people. Which had some impact. It is a very powerful thing to watch. The extent to which it has moved society forwards is questionable. So under Schaap's minimalist model, we could say that in Australia there is at least some shared political responsibility between the indigenous and the settlers to try and move things forward. This political responsibility recognizes that the indigenous people have the right not to reconcile or forgive. They cannot be forced to forgive. And this means that there is no relief to the guilt that the settlers may feel about what's happened in the past. So those psychologically active qualities of guilt and the right not to forgive remain in place. That there is no end point, there is no final settlement here, and the pressure, therefore, for reparation continues. And that truth-telling continues also, but this doesn't necessarily relieve the guilt that the settlers feel. So you have a political dynamic here, where some of these processes of truth-telling and apology and so forth continue to generate new political energy for change. But they don't completely, or they don't seek to resolve completely the problems that have been created. So that is the minimalist model. Now let's look at, in the middle of the spectrum, a deliberative model. I'm going to look at a famous one, much used in the field by Brandon Hamber and Graham Kelly, developed in Northern Ireland. And they said that reconciliation is comprised of 5 simultaneous strands of activity. The first, and this is interesting, the area that I described as the least well developed, which is creating a shared vision of what an interdependent and fair society would look like. Secondly, there is acknowledging and dealing with the past. Thirdly, there is an active program of building positive relationships, separate from the dealing with the past and separate from the vision. So at community, at individual, at community, and at political levels, a lot of focus on building positive relationships. Thirdly, significant cultural and attitudinal change. This has proved very controversial because it is certainly the case that to achieve reconciliation, attitudes to the past and perceptions that people have of other people have to change. But this can sometimes come into conflict with people's sense of cultural identity. So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, the Protestant community resists reconciliation because it feels its own cultural history and identity may be threatened. But it is the case, when you look at reconciliation, that attitudes, perceptions, prejudices, stereotypes have to change. And then the fifth strand is substantial social, economic, and political change. Changing the unjust and system that has created or the conflict and its damage. So a deliberative model says there are 5 areas of work that we have to concentrate on. It also raises some very interesting points, though. The first is that reconciliation will almost always involve the idea of paradox, of contradiction, of trying to bring together things that are in tension with each other. So for instance, how do we simultaneously express the pain of the past and articulate a vision of the future? Those are 2 very different activities of the human soul. How do we bring them together? And which is more important? How much time do we spend on the past? And how much time do we devote to the future? Secondly, what emphasis do we put on dealing with the past? And what emphasis do we put on restoring relationships? And thirdly, justice may sometimes be contradictory to peace. That holding every perpetrator of violence or injustice, or human rights abuse, legally responsible and processing that through the criminal justice system may not be the way to achieve peace. Sometimes showing mercy towards those who admit and show contrition for what they've done in the past may be the way to reintegrate them into society. And this raises a very interesting point about, I said at the beginning that people may have different expectations of reconciliation. Hamber and Kelly talk about how these may take the form of different ideological differences. So here are 4 different attitudes towards the future that people may hold. For some people, the priority may be rebuilding a community, ensuring social cohesion. Another person may be concerned primarily with human rights. Another person may be concerned primarily with the healing of victims. Some people may approach reconciliation from the point of view of religious conviction. You can see how those different expectations, those different cultural and political assumptions may well not fit together. So, just very briefly to touch on the third approach, which is the maximalist approach. This is one that talks explicitly in terms of damage, woundedness, and the moral repair of society. I haven't time to go into the details here, but the political philosopher Daniel Philpott talks about how conflict and past abuse harms the political system. And he talks about the wounds of political injustice. And interestingly enough, look at numbers 1 and 6. We can understand number 1 easily, harm to the person of the victim. But he also says how another form of woundedness is that conflict harms the soul of the perpetrator, the person who has inflicted damage on society, is somehow morally or ethically wounded, and that needs to be dealt with as well. And he talks about there being 6 practices that you can be used in that. And these are familiar words, but by now you will know we have to think very carefully about in what sense we are using these in any situation. I'm going to skip this one. There's another example of a narrative model. So onto my conclusions. Some personal conclusions here. The first is that we have to decide whether, or think about whether, when we talk about reconciliation, we are talking about reconciliation as a goal. We want to be reconciled. Or is it a process, a continuing process of activity that peels away the layers of the past and enables a new structure to be built gradually? Or is reconciliation a condition? Is reconciliation a sense of anxiety and unease to which we must respond in whatever way we can find? It's, of course, a bit of all 3. Secondly, that in thinking about reconciliation, we need, as Lederach says, to hold in balance past, present, and future. And I will just reiterate my point, that my observation is that many reconciliation processes have focused much more on the past than on the future. And that may be something that could be explored here. You, of course, will be contributing to the great pool of knowledge and experience of reconciliation. Thirdly, there is the question of diversity of expectations. When we enter into a process of reconciliation, how do we know what other people think about what we should be trying to achieve? So what Eduardo has said about needing to base it on consultation is crucial. At Winchester University, we are doing some research to try and look at how people express those expectations and how their hopes and fears about the future can be documented and the contradictions between them explored. And then the final thing I'd want to say is beware of models. This is a world, the world of reconciliation, has more than its fair share of diagrams, processes, and so forth. So my advice here is to beware of trying to take a model off the shelf or even create what looks like a perfect model on paper, but may really not work out in practice. The place to start is with the stories of the people involved in the conflict, the stories of the victims, the stories of the perpetrators, and the stories of the onlookers. Everybody has a story to tell, not just the victims. And the really important insight that Lederach has given me, that these are not just stories of the past, these are stories about the hopes and the fears that people hold at the present time about what the future looks like. And a process of reconciliation is really about finding ways of realizing those hopes and dealing with those fears. Thank you very much.